Hello everybody and most welcome to H709. And speaking of nines, we're actually in the magic room, room number 9 of the Gothenburg University Library. As we are very far from sunlight, oxygen, this is down in the bunker. And what could be more fitting than having something very, very complicated to speak about here? And it's regarding Kalle, my colleague here, asked me about what is a nominalist. Well, there used to be a philosophical battle between the nominalist and the universalist. And since universalism is the more common form, especially today, let's start with the universals and sort of slip into the nominalistic turn. Universals are general things, properties, objects, classes, designations. And a universalist claim that properties, objects are real outside of time and space. So they're not part of this world, but they are still very real. One obvious universalist is, of course, Plato. Plato meant that the properties had an individual and separate existence in the world of ideas. But there are, however, people who've been thinking there are some problems with the universals. People coming from all strands of learning, like logic, philosophy, science. It's a very, very big problem within science. And I'd say it's, oddly enough, even though we don't have the battle between universalist and nominalist, the battle is within science bigger than it ever was. And that is actually caused by quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics put in a wrench in the machinery of the universals. I haven't mentioned that before, but it's a rather amazing thing, because nothing in quantum mechanics can actually be identical to itself. So, of course, that's going to pose problems for universals. If not even one thing is identical to itself, how can you have universals? And this is the strange thing with quantum mechanics, because this question was, until quantum mechanics, non-disputed, but even more interesting, it was seen as a purely logical or philosophical question. Nothing that had anything to do with the empirical. And oddly enough, quantum mechanics is so weirdly constructed that it had logical things to say, philosophical things to say. And how weird isn't that? But we've spoken about these things, and what is with quantum mechanics, it combines philosophy and science and logic as well. So things that we take for granted to be of a separate modality, existing outside in time and space, are actually right here in this world. So there is a huge objection, and therefore I realize now, standing and talking here, it's very due time to take up the subject of universals and nominalists, because it's a very important subject. And this, of course, is going to be start of the whole thing. I might get back to it in 50 lectures or something, because it takes some time to get into it. One usually say like this: universals are qualities or relations. Could be either or both. And they have to be found in more than two entities. So if you say that the cup holder is circular in some way, you can say that circularity is a sort of a universal property of cup holders. Further, if two daughters can be considered female offspring of a father, the qualities of being female, offspring, and of father are universal properties of the two daughters. They have three different. Many properties can be universal: being human, red, male, female, liquid, solid, big or small, etc., etc. Philosophers agree on a general scale that human beings can talk and think about universals, but disagree on whether universals exist in reality beyond mere thought and speech. Plato, of course, good old Plato has to come into the equation. We can't leave him out of this. He's one of the founders of modern thinking. Well, at least the formulation might be that this thinking of Plato going on long before Plato. He believed that there was a very sharp distinction between a world that was perceivable, the world of percepts, and the world of ideas, and that there were two different worlds altogether and had nothing to do with each other. This is, of course, the birth of dualism. So, for human beings, it's possible only to have opinions of the ideas. But we can have knowledge of the percepts, we can experience. But he sees that as a problem, and he goes even further and said, this is starting to get a little scary. You cannot have knowledge even of the world. And that is what he called in Swedish, sinnevärlden. What he meant was there was no knowledge possible in the sinnevärld, the world of percepts.
Perception.
Perception. The only knowledge that we could have was of the ideas, and that knowledge was usually inferred, not direct. So we could have an inference of the ideas. So this we could perceive, and this we couldn't perceive. That was the real world. Scary, isn't it?
Mm.
I always see Plato working in some sort of mental institution, but he doesn't cure the patients. New people coming to the institution, maybe for selling some stuff or just visiting, they are tricked into going to the cellar, and they meet Plato in some dark room, and he starts saying, "Do you really know what is real?" And then he tricked the person to believe everything that he feels and knows, that's unreal. It's actually something else that's more real. And after a month or two, I think that person will be ready to step to the second floor and ready for his straitjacket and medication or lobotomy, whatever he needs by them. Yes, it is very scary. It's almost as scary as Descartes, who wondered whether he existed or not. And you don't want to meet such a person late at night, I can imagine, especially not in the center of a mental institution. But here's a bit extreme, Plato, of course. There are more sensible ideas of universals. And it's good to know that the greatest philosopher of antiquity thought that universals were more real than reality. And you hear how that's a very odd way to go about things. Aristotle, one could say, and I'm not going to dwell too much on Aristotle, he didn't agree completely. He had a more sensible view. But he did say that universals had an existence. And that existence, of course, is not of this world. Universals cannot exist in this world to a certain degree. If they are completely true, non-taintable, and the object of development, as Aristotle said, then they have to be rather pure, not tainted by the world. But people started to think about this, and that happened the first time in medieval philosophy, medieval time. And one of the greater philosophers of medieval time was Boethius. And he said as following: I shall omit to speak about genera and species, a different word for universals, as to whether they subsist in the nature of things or in mere conceptions only, whether also if subsistent they are bodies or incorporeal, or whether they are separate from or insensibles, and subsist of these. For such a treatise is most profound and requires another more extensive investigation. So Boethius is saying that a universal, if it were to exist, has to apply to several particulars entirely. And that's a problem. For instance, if you have an individual, here I have an individual book, and then you have the properties of the book, which are universals. Where does the individual begin? And where does the universal begin? Let me just ponder about this for a while. When I see a book, I will go to think a book. That's a universal, of course. But this book is unique. In what ways are they unique? Where does the uniqueness start? Well, for one matter, if I found this book in the library, the first uniqueness, which turns out to be universal, is the specific title of the book. This edition. But that's not unique, is it? Because the edition you can find somewhere else. It's probably tens of thousands of it. So that's not unique there. And then you have this unique specimen. And the more you try to find universals, the less you have of the individual. They disappear. Redness, take away redness, blackness, the folder, letters, they're all part of universals, 28 letters. And the papers are part of the universals papers. So in the end you have nothing left. Maybe some scratch marks, because those are unique to this book. But we know to be an individual has to be a bit more than that. So that's an interesting problem with universals and the nominals as well. Where does one start and where does the other begin? we see here, somewhere in medieval time, people started to ponder about this, because it's not as simple as Plato says, not at all. He haven't given enough thought to the whole object, I would say. And there's another stuff. Do they appear simultaneous? The universes in the book, are they coming simultaneous, or there is some temporal order to them? We usually think being a book is more like coming first. When I go into the library and I see a book, well, first and foremost they are books. So there's a specific order to them. And there have to be traits. There has to be traits that are specific and like this label, which is unique for this institution. We have a label here. This is unique for this institution. That has to come last. So there is a problem of temporality as well. Plato didn't think about those things. And I think this started the criticism, and I don't know if Boetius was read by William of Ockham. And William of Ockham is the first pure nominalist. He really goes to battle with Plato and said, this won't work in reality, it's impossible. We have to draw the line somewhere, or we have to use our razor. Ockham was famous for his razor example. Don't use more things than you need to explain something. Be concise, don't overdo it. And he started thinking that universes are pointless. Well, at least they could be helping tools, but they do not exist. If you start saying that they exist, you end up in these problems. Because things that are existing, we can usually ask the question, where are they? And when are they? Because this cookie is going to be gone soon. The cookie is no longer. So there is a temporality and there is an extension. So proper objects, individuals, have those things, whereas universals don't have that. Red cannot have a temporality to it, it's eternal. There's loads of interesting. What he says, there could be something in common with individuals, but that's only in my head. That's something I choose to think at some instance. And I would say all books are similar. That's nothing in the books. It's just in my mind. And he said in the end, the only thing that exists are individuals, and there doesn't exist sets or properties. Because in a way you can't have properties if you don't have universals. A property that only applies to one thing doesn't exist. Actually, one property would be actually going to against the idea of private language. So what he says, a universal is not something real. It's not in time and space. It has a being only as a thought object in the mind. Objecto in anima, you can say. Something in the soul. And at the same time I stop thinking about it, it disappears. In the 19th century, we find a British philosopher, John Stuart Mill, and he discussed the problem of universals in the course of a book that eviscerated the philosophy of, for instance, Sir William Hamilton, who was also engaged in this. And Mill wrote, "The formation of a concept does not consisting in separating the attributes which are said to compose it from all other attributes of the same object, and enabling us to conceive those attributes, disjoined from any others. We neither conceive them, nor think them, nor cognize them in any way as a thing apart, but solely as forming in combination with numerous other attributes the idea of an individual object." And he has a point there. We even if there are some sort of universals, they're not separated as I just presented here. Presented the book and I said red, and I said book, and I said folder, I said paper. That's never happening. The qualities are not separable. Cannot take them apart. They are integral to the book. They're in the book in some way. So even if I can have different words for them, I can use that word to reproduce something. For instance, red. I'm a painter myself and I can use red when I paint. But it's actually the thing, especially when you paint in oil painting, that you know the color cannot be separated from what its substance is. It's a handy word to use when you want to explain something, ask for something, order something, but redness is intimately connected to the color itself. And you notice that with oil paintings because there's so many tonalities and different qualities of the oil paints. Many people think they're all the same. They're not. Some are more fluid, liquid, other ones are more gelatinous. And that's because the ground material, which used to be mostly minerals, they're all different. The natural world is all different. So it's, in a way, the idea of colors being separated from the world is a modern phenomenon. Because today we have all these magic colors that pop out of nowhere, and they can actually be made to seem somewhat similar. So Mill has a point there. There seems to be a connection between the material world and the universals. And you can't take one part away from the other. You lose something in the process. You lose reality. And maybe that's what Heidegger would call 400, an unreal process. That sometimes could be a reason for doing. Maybe in the laboratory. So we're going out here to look at the most beautiful part.
This is Versailles and Hall of Mirrors.
Yes, it's amazing what they can build. But Mill, he proceeds, because this is also criticism of Bishop Berkeley. But though meaning them only as part of a larger agglomeration, we have the power of fixing our attention on them, to neglect of the other attributes with which we think them combined. While the concentration of attention lasts, if it's sufficiently intense, we may be temporarily unconscious of any other attributes, and may really, for a brief interval, have nothing present to our mind but the attributes constituents of the concept. So what Mill means is that we can be temporarily unconscious of whether an image is white, black or yellow, and concentrate our attention on the fact that it is a man, and just those attributes necessary to identify it as a man, but not as a particular one. It may then have the significance of a universal of manhood. This sounds so much better than Plato. But I say it sounds. When you really think of it, it's in the same category as Plato. This is sort of scary as well. If you really concentrate, like Mill suggested here, and you say that you can only see the universal, there's no natural position where you would do that. It doesn't really happen, not in this reality. One thing to ask is, why would you do such a thing? It would be highly unnatural to meet somebody and I'm going to see that person only as a man and nothing else, not as an individual with clothing, scars, different numbers of fingers, tall, fat, short, you name it. It doesn't make any sense. So why should we take something that never happens and use that as an example to prove universals? And remember now we are talking about some sort of compromise, because no one ever went for that extreme position that Plato held after Plato held it. Although it lasted at least 1,000 years, let's say. It depends how you see it, because Plato didn't come to the Western world directly after the fall of the Rome. So maybe, let's say 700 years before Boetius criticized the whole thing. We have a rather interesting philosopher with 3 first names. I just refer him to Orman Quine. He addressed problems of universals throughout his career. And he even wrote a paper called On Universals in 1947. And he stated that the problem of universals is chiefly understood as being concerned with entities and not the linguistic aspect of naming a universal. He says that the Platonists believe that our ability to form general conceptions of things is incomprehensible unless universals exist outside of the mind. Whereas nominalists believe that such ideas are empty verbalism, like Occam. Quine himself does not propose to resolve this particular debate. What he does say, however, is that certain type of discourse presupposes universals. Nominalists, therefore, must give these up. Quine's approach is therefore more an epistemological one, i.e. what can be known rather than a metaphysical one, i.e. what is real. And this is really interesting. This came in 1947, and obviously Quine didn't take note of quantum mechanics. Because in quantum mechanics you get a very proper realization of the impossibility of universals that are independent of anything. Actually, what quantum mechanics shows is there are hardly anything that is independent. And what does that mean? Well, I'm going to take an example directly. Kalle just asked me earlier here that some people think that the extension of letters, the ink on paper or whatever it is, somehow separated from semantics or phonetics. And even when I say a word, there is a vibration in the air. And that could also be said, if you want to further this discussion that weird way, and say the vibration has nothing to do with the phonetics. And that's a discussion I actually had with a phonetic professor here close by, the linguistics section, Per Lindén, many years ago. And he was very keen on the oscilloscope, and he showed that all words have sort of a wave going around, a sinus wave. You can see what somebody's saying, and somewhere a discussion started. So where does the phoneme start, and where do they end? Because you can write lines, say, for instance, you want to say staircase, with a staircase here. You can make lines in the phonetic diagram, the sound waves, and you can say here the F starts, here the S starts, and here the T starts, and all that. But we saw, sorry sir, but it seems that they are all interconnected. You can't really see, there's no stop in between them. There's no stop between S and T, and especially A in staircase goes into the S and T. And he just answered, oh, I'm glad you noticed that. Phonemes only have an existence when we talk about them. But look here on the wave, they go into each other. And I think that is heading in the direction of Occam, a little bit. Maybe his position is too extreme, but you can't separate things like that. It's a handy tool, but we need to know how handy it is. We need to know what sort of forehand are we doing. And go too hard into those things and you get a really weird idea of what a language is. I used to have a phonetics teacher, and I can talk about her now because she's stopped working many years ago. She learned all the different pronunciation of the English vocabulary, and it sounded so unreal because they were not together. For them to be together, you have to be in your body, that's the only chance. But she wanted to do something like a rule game, how to pronounce the words, and that didn't work at all. It sounded affected, unnatural, and it didn't sound like language at all to some of the English people in the class. I remember that. Britt-Marie was her name. And see these things as tools, and they are never excluding each other. They're always complementary, because we use the tools in concord with all the other facts we have. Just like a book is consisting of different attributes. And at some time in the language, it's very handy to separate them. If you, for instance, want the color red, or something I often ask for, I need some paper. And sometimes it doesn't matter, you're just given a piece of paper, but sometimes people want to have a specification. Do you want to have a paper and you can write on? Or do you want a paper to clean your hands or something like that? But sometimes it's unnecessary to specify, because it's enough just to say paper. And the circumstances could be various, could be no other than one certain kind of paper available. Like I could obviously have a snotty nose or something like that. And they wouldn't ask in a real situation, oh, do you want a piece of paper and write that you have a snotty face or something like that? Mm. So everything in reality is interconnected, and don't trust a philosopher like Mill, who takes an example that's not in reality, because that's the first step of not saying anything sensible. Reality is here somehow. I know that doesn't mean much, but at least try to go in that direction, wherever that can be, because separation, yes, sometimes is very handy, but I would say it's not a natural trait. And my own position in the battle between universalist and nominalist would be something like this. I would first take the position of Ocker, because in the domination of Plato, all his critique was just, I would say, attack very hard, make a frontal attack with the cavalry, go into attack of Plato. But then afterwards, when that attack is finished, you must ask yourself, what is the reality of an individual thing? What makes it real? And that's an important question. There is a coercive effect of the universals and the nominal. And how that affects actually our reality, we cannot answer, but we know it's a sort of a complementary thing. But definitely, the hard attack he made on Platonism and similar universalists, like for instance Augustine, was the same view as Plato, was due. It was just about time, because that was obsessing the people. Then afterwards you should ask yourself, what is an individual then? But in that correct order. Don't start anywhere else. And for God's sake, don't do the attack smaller, just because you know it's going to come a contra-argument. The truth never lies in between, never, ever. Truth is not to compromise. And I think that's enough for universalists and nominalists today. Maybe I'll get back to this subject in 50 episodes or something. But go figure now. Have a pleasant afternoon.
Thank you.